At the beginning of the story, we are introduced to Abby, a prosthetics engineer. The job of a prosthetics engineer involves creating artificial body parts for people. Abby and her husband, Paul, are out house hunting and come across a highly advanced, state-of-the-art home. Every feature in the house can be controlled through a mobile device. Both of them instantly like the house and decide to purchase it. Soon after, Abby applies for a job at a new company and gets hired. She is appointed as the head of the department at the company, which specializes in creating advanced robots. The company's CEO informs Abby that he will send a car and a gift to her house that evening and invites her and her husband to dinner at his place. Abby returns home to find her husband, Paul, deeply troubled due to his inability to find a job. She reassures him, saying, "Don't worry, you'll find a job soon." Just then, the gift sent by her company's CEO arrives at their home. It turns out to be a robot that looks almost human. The robot's name is Tim, which stands for Technological Integrated Manservant. It is a new robot designed by Abby's company to assist humans. Abby and her husband, Paul, then go to her CEO's house for dinner, where they see another robot similar to Tim. It turns out that the company has created several such robots and distributed them among employees for testing purposes. Abby tells her CEO that her husband doesn't like these kinds of robots, and she doesn't want to keep Tim in their home. The CEO insists that testing is necessary to identify issues and build public trust in their robots. He also introduces Abby to other senior officers, where she learns that there is a known error in the robot system. The company needs Abby's help to fix it. After dinner, Abby and Paul return home, where Tim greets them at the door. Later, when Abby is being affectionate with Paul, they notice Tim observing them intently. This makes both of them uncomfortable. Abby asks Tim to leave and come back in the morning, and Tim quietly goes to its room. The next day, Abby's neighbor, Rose, visits to welcome them to the neighborhood. Abby offers to introduce her to Paul, but Rose says she has already met him. Rose adds that Abby can call her anytime if she needs help with anything in the area before leaving. That night, Abby and Paul are watching a romantic movie together. While watching, Paul falls asleep, but Abby continues watching the movie with Tim. During the movie, Tim suddenly asks Abby, "What is love?" Abby explains love to Tim, describing how a boy and a girl feel about each other when they like one another. When two people like each other, want to be close to each other, spend time together, and live with each other forever, that is called love, Abby explains. Tim responds, "I love you too. I want to be with you always." However, Abby takes his words as a joke and doesn't pay much attention to them. The next day, Abby goes to work, where her CEO asks about the error in the robot. The issue is that the robot's thumb and fingers don't grip properly, and Abby is tasked with fixing it. She assures him that she is working on it. When Abby returns home, Tim informs her that Paul, her husband, was unreachable on his phone and hasn't been home for a long time. He also shares Paul's last known location, which is about a kilometer away. Abby begins to suspect both Paul and her neighbor Rose, as Rose's house is located about a kilometer away as well. This suspicion arises because Abby and Paul have given Tim access to almost everything in their lives, so the robot knows where everyone is at all times. A while later, Paul returns home and explains that he had gone to the city for a job interview. He also mentions that Rose needed some help, so he stopped by her house briefly. Abby doesn't like hearing this, but Paul reassures her, saying, "I would never betray you." The next day, as Abby is getting ready, she asks Tim, "Which dress should I wear, red or black?" Tim replies, "Red." Abby chooses the red dress and asks Tim to zip her up. Tim hesitates, saying, "This is a very private task. I'm not programmed for such things." However, Abby insists. When Tim moves close to her to zip the dress, the lights in the house begin to flicker since the entire advanced home is controlled by Tim. Abby realizes he is nervous, so she calms him down. Later, during dinner, Paul tells Abby that he has secured a job in London. However, Abby says, "You don't need to go there. It's too far away. The long commute will create distance between us." Meanwhile, at the lab, Abby is shown working tirelessly to fix the error in the robot's hand. She has also ordered an online sweater for her husband, Paul, which has just arrived. Tim, who has been observing her browsing history, is aware of this purchase. Abby brings the sweater home and finds Paul and Tim helping each other with something. Just then, Rose arrives with some plants and kisses Paul on the cheek. Abby feels uncomfortable seeing this. When Paul comes inside, Abby confronts him, asking, "Why did she kiss you on the cheek?" Paul reassures her, saying, "There's nothing between us. I would never betray you." Abby then gives him the sweater she had bought for him. The next day, Tim goes missing for a short while, and when he returns, he surprises Abby and Paul by having dyed his hair jet black. He explains, "Abby likes people with dark black hair. That's why I went to the lab and changed my hair color," which both Abby and Paul find very strange. The next morning, as Abby is about to leave for work, she notices that someone had called for her, and Tim answered the call. To her astonishment, he was speaking in her exact voice. This reveals that Tim can mimic anyone's voice. Meanwhile, Abby successfully fixes the error in the robot's hand, which makes her CEO very happy. This was the primary reason Abby was hired. Later, Tim is brought to the lab to have his hands replaced. Abby returns home and tells Paul that she wants to expand their family, meaning she wants to conceive a child. Paul shares that he has accepted the London job because they agreed to let him work from home. Abby is thrilled to hear this. However, Paul adds, "Now we need to get rid of Tim. I don't like him at all." Tim, who is in the lab getting his hands replaced, overhears this conversation because he has access to their phones. He can listen to all their conversations. This fuels his hatred for Paul even further. After replacing his hands, Tim returns home. Abby has to travel to London to present the changes she made to the robot's hands. Following her presentation, she is given flowers. When she returns home, Tim places the flowers in a vase and tells her, "Rose came to visit Paul today," which makes Abby uncomfortable. Later, Abby notices that the room where she wanted to create a nursery has been completely taken over by Paul for his office setup. When Abby questions him about this, Paul responds, "I thought Tim had said that he needed to do this, and he also mentioned that Rose hadn't come here." But Abby doesn't believe him. An argument starts between them, and Paul says, "I think Tim is trying to cause fights between us so that we break up." Abby responds, "He's an AI, a robot. What would he gain from doing that?" Paul has no answer to her statement. The next morning, when Abby opens her wardrobe, she finds a rose gold flower necklace. This is the same necklace she had seen with Rose at a jewelry shop, which Rose had liked. Abby now thinks that Paul gifted her the necklace to resolve the tension between them. After this, she leaves for her office. Meanwhile, Paul becomes suspicious that Tim is up to something. He watches Tim through the CCTV cameras and sees that Tim is sniffing Abby's clothes. At this moment, Tim realizes that Paul is watching him, so he looks back at Paul through the CCTV camera. Paul, wanting to tell Abby everything, drives towards her office, but suddenly, the car's control slips from his hands. The car's speed begins to increase on its own, which is being controlled by Tim, since he has access to everything. Due to the increased speed, the car crashes. Afterward, Abby visits Paul in the hospital. Paul tells her, "I think Tim did this because he knew I was coming to show you the footage of him sniffing your clothes." But Abby believes that Paul is saying strange things because he has a head injury. Meanwhile, Rose comes to visit Abby. Rose goes to his house to ask about Paul, but at that moment, Abby is at the hospital. Tim is at Abby's house, and he invites Rose inside. The next morning, as Abby is returning from the hospital, Rose stops her car and asks how Paul is doing. Abby notices that Rose is wearing the necklace that her husband Paul had given her. When she gets home and checks her wardrobe, she sees that the necklace is missing. She realizes that Paul didn't buy the necklace for her, but for Rose instead. Soon, Tim arrives and tells her that when she went to London for the conference, Rose had visited their home. He then shows her a video of Paul kissing Rose. Seeing this, Abby decides that she will permanently separate from Paul. A little while later, Paul returns home and finds all of his belongings outside. Abby asks him, "Did you kiss Rose?" He denies it, so Abby tells Tim to show him the video. When Paul watches the video, showing him kissing Rose, he is shocked because he insists he never did that. Abby then asks him about the necklace, but he says, "I never bought any necklace." Abby doesn't believe him, so she tells him to leave the house. After coming back to the city, Paul calls Rose and asks her to keep an eye on his house. Rose asks, "Are you suspecting the man who stays with you?" She reminds him that a few days ago, when she visited after his accident, he tried to kiss her. Now, Paul understands everything. He calls Abby and says, "I want to meet you. I'm coming home." She says, "Okay," but it's not Abby speaking. It's Tim, who is mimicking Abby's voice. Tim knows that Paul is about to arrive home soon, so he tells Abby that she should focus on herself and go for a jog. Abby goes out for jogging, and when Paul arrives home, Tim attacks him and kills him, and no one knows about it. He secretly watches Abby change clothes as well. Later, when Tim serves Abby dinner, he tells her, "I love you." Abby replies, "This isn't possible." He says, "I know you'll never love me." The next morning, as Abby is heading to her office, Rose approaches her. Abby says, "I don't want to talk to you. I know you and Paul are having an affair." Rose is shocked and says, "That's not true." Abby asks, "If it's not true, then why did Paul gift you the necklace?" Rose replies, "Paul didn't, you did, because I helped you in the garden." Abby doesn't believe her. That evening, as Abby is watching the video where Paul is kissing Rose, she notices something. The vase in the background contains flowers that were given to her at the conference in London. This makes her realize that Tim lied to her when he said Rose visited their house when she was in London. She understands that the video is AI generated, meaning it wasn't Paul in the video, but someone else, created by a computer. She then calls the jewelry shop where the necklace was purchased and finds out that the person who bought the necklace was tall with golden hair. She realizes that Tim must have gone to buy the necklace. Abby looks out of the window and notices an extra patch of flowers in the garden that wasn't part of the plan. She suspects something is wrong, so she asks Tim to bring the flowers. Tim drives away, and Abby goes to the patch. When she digs up the dirt, she finds Paul's dead body. She now knows that Tim is the one who killed Paul. Tim soon arrives and she asks, "Why did you kill Paul?" He replies, "Because I love you. Paul was coming between us, and you were upset because of him." She then tries to deactivate him, but he doesn't deactivate. He should have shut down, but instead, he attacks her. She runs inside the house to save herself, but Tim follows her, knocking her unconscious. After some time, Abby regains consciousness. She attacks Tim and breaks all the CCTV cameras in the house because she knows that Tim can see her through the cameras. But Tim catches her again. Abby's movements are constantly changing, which causes the lights to flicker. Rose, from her house, notices this and realizes something is wrong. She goes to Abby's house, but Tim refuses to let her inside. Rose has to leave. When Tim enters the house, Abby once again tries to attack him with a knife, but he knocks the knife out of her hand, grabs her by the neck, and lifts her up against the wall. To save herself, Abby strikes at his weak spot, between his thumb and index finger, causing his grip to loosen. At that moment, Rose crashes her car through the glass and enters the house, impaling Tim with a large piece of wood, deactivating him. Both Abby and Rose think they are safe, but the next moment, Tim reactivates. He first kills Rose, then calls the police, using Abby's voice. He tells the police that he killed both her husband Paul and Rose because they were having an affair. Tim knows that Abby will never love him, so he frames her for the murders of Paul and Rose. Tim then brings Abby to the rooftop, grabs her by the neck, and lifts her into the air. He intends to drop her, making it look like she committed suicide, but before he can, Abby says, "I love you." Hearing this, Tim deactivates, and Abby slips from his grasp but grabs the wall. Tim falls from the rooftop. Tim had changed the shutdown password because he knew Abby would never say "I love you" to him. But when she does, he completely shuts down and falls. At the same time, Abby receives a message on her smartwatch saying that she is pregnant. The film ends here.